Then what else is one to live by? And how do you hear this message when you don't have enough bread to live by? What else is there to live by? When I was a kid, which was a long time ago, the 60s, we still heard the command from our parents, empty your plate. There are starving children in China. The message was, don't waste. Someone else in the world isn't as fortunate as you, and to leave food on your plate would be an insult to them. Nice try. No offense, Mom, but I never bought the argument that I needed to clean that eggplant parmesan from my plate. And just for the record, I never left steak or French fries or fried chicken or bacon or bread on my plate. The only things I ever left were those things I didn't like. Those vegetables and things I didn't like, I would have gladly paid the postage to send them to those starving kids in China. Those starving children in China comments were a product of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America of that time. Finishing the abundance on your plate, the abundance was not a problem for everyone in mid-century America, as we call it now. It was a statement of plenty to insist that a child eat every bean and pea on their plate. Not everyone in America shared in that plenty back then, and fewer Americans share in that plenty now. Today we insist on organic foods. Today we insist on foods that have had no genetic modification, no pesticides, no antibiotics or steroids. Today we insist on foods that are fresh, foods with few additives or preservatives, foods that are low in sodium and cholesterol, foods that are minimally processed and with minimal additives. Basically, we're insisting on the abundance of food created by scientific advances of today with the quality and nutrition of the food grown by methods used 75 or more years ago. And we want that food at a price that leaves most farmers bankrupt and most producers, as we call those who take that raw food from the farmers and market them, receiving the only profit. But when you're hungry, when you're starving, things like nutrition and modification and organic labels have no meaning when the price of those healthier food choices are beyond your means. When you can buy a gallon of milk for more money than it costs to buy a gallon of soda, Coke and Pepsi cash in and your children's bones lose out. When those fried pork rinds and chips and fat-rich, salt-encrusted, carb-loaded, protein-poor foods are less expensive than an equal serving of a healthy alternative, what are you going to feed your family when you're on a really tight budget? Of course, eating less healthy foods leads to less healthy people, mostly because less healthy foods add more calories to your diet. And as a result, more calories mean more weight gain. The way foods are grown and produced, while lowering the cost of food, only complicate the issue. And as a result of this dietary spiral, the incidence of obesity in this country, especially among the poor, has reached epidemic levels. The result of this epidemic is incredible suffering for a disproportionate segment of our population. Those who can least afford a proper diet, and as a result, those who have little or no health insurance to cope with the obesity and other issues that result from that poor diet, they suffer the most. And add to this misery, along come the political seems to make the substance too expensive to afford, and in the process, as a bonus, add some serious coin to the government's coffers. True, as a result, some will never start smoking because of the expense, and that is a good thing. Unfortunately, this kind of tax really only makes an addiction more expensive for the addict. The result is that the government profits from the misery of addiction. Now, it's true that some of the tax money goes toward prevention and abstinence, which is a noble cause. But where does the bulk of that money go? Where does the bulk of the $5 to $7 in taxes collected on every pack of cigarettes go? Anyone? And we want to use this model with food now. When it's proven that the vast majority of those who pay the sin tax, as we call it, on tobacco and alcohol, are those who live in poverty. We want to use this same model with food. When those who are affected by obesity are disproportionately living in poverty. We want to use this model with food when those who are affected by the negative health effects of obesity have little or no health insurance, and therefore limited access to quality health care. Is our solution to the consumption of low-health food to shame those who are poor, to blame those who are obese, and to profit on the backs of such suffering and misery? One does not live by bread alone. Jesus was just another poor peasant living in Galilee. Of course, living in poverty in Jesus' day was not about access to healthy food, but access to any food. Access to enough daily bread to keep oneself and one's family literally from starvation. Where obesity and malnutrition plague us today, malnutrition and starvation plagued the vast majority of the population in Jesus' day. Jesus lived in the midst of a system that condemned many to a life of misery and scarcity so that a few could live in plenty and luxury. Those in Jesus' time wondered daily if they would find enough to eat. So when Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness without food, when his very human stomach endures without the luxury of daily bread, Jesus is reminded by the devil that he can simply end his human suffering by using his divinity to change a stone into a loaf of bread. Jesus' response to the devil is all the more intense. One does not live by bread alone. And my question to Jesus on that point would have been, so then, lacking daily bread, what else is one to live on? And Jesus answers my question with his three responses to Satan's temptations. One does not live by bread alone. Worship the Lord your God and him only, and do not put the Lord your God to the test. The one thing in all of Jesus' responses to the devil that they have in common is God. Or more specifically, dependence on God. Dependence on God is a good term, but a better one is probably being sustained by God. Jesus' statement of faith to the devil is not one of independence, to use his own powers and abilities. His ability as the Son of God to turn a stone into a loaf of bread. Jesus' statement of faith to the devil is about allowing himself to be dependent on God, to be sustained by God, to depend on God for what he needs to live, and to depend on the Word of God to sustain his daily life. Being sustained is not just about the needs of the body, like food and water. Sustenance is not primarily about food. It's ultimately about living in relationship with God. The good news today is that living is not just about daily bread. Those with a full stomach have no exclusive claim on living. And conversely, those who have no daily bread are not excluded from the life that God offers us. Full stomach, empty stomach, any kind of stomach in between. Living is not simply about feeding the body. It's more about feeding the soul. The good today is that, like Moses and the Israelites before us, whom God brought out of the wilderness into that land of milk and honey he promised them, the story of salvation, the story of living in complete dependence on God, the story of being sustained not only by daily bread, but more importantly, by the Word of God daily, is our story too. The good news today is that one does not live by bread alone. One lives through the gift of salvation offered by a loving God, paid for by the sacrifice of his life for us on the cross. One